Chapter 2 Progress and Freud's Theory of Instincts. Let me begin by defining the two main types of the concept of progress that are characteristic of the modern period of Western culture. The first defines progress as a predominantly quantitative phenomenon and avoids linking the concept with any positive valuations. In this view, progress means that in the course of cultural development, despite many periods of regression, human knowledge and capacities taken as a whole have grown, and that simultaneously their application to the end of dominating the human and natural environment has become ever more universal. The result of this progress is growing social wealth. In the same measure that civilization evolves, man's needs expand along with the means of their gratification. This leaves open the question whether such progress contributes to the perfection of man, to a freer and happier existence. We can call this quantitative concept of progress the concept of technical progress and contrast it with the second type, the qualitative conception of progress that was developed especially by idealist philosophy and, in its most trenchant form, by Hegel. According to this conception, progress in history consists in the realization of human freedom, of morality. More and more men become free, and the very consciousness of freedom spurs on an extension of the sphere of freedom. The result of progress is taken to be that human beings become continually more human and that slavery, arbitrariness, oppression, and suffering are reduced. We can call this qualitative concept of progress the idea of humanitarian progress. Now there is an interconnection between the quantitative and qualitative conceptions of progress. Technical progress seems to be the precondition of all humanitarian progress. The development of mankind from slavery and poverty to a less than focusing freedom presupposes a less than equal progress. That is, a high degree 28 of domination of nature, which is the sole basis of social wealth, through which in turn human needs can be more humanely structured and gratified. On the other hand, it is not as though technical progress automatically brings about humanitarian progress. For the existence of technical progress tells us nothing about the way in which social wealth is distributed or into whose service growing human knowledge and capacities are impressed. Technical progress, which as such is the precondition of freedom, in no way implies the realization of greater freedom. We only need to depict for ourselves the idea of a totalitarian welfare state, which is no longer so abstract and speculative, in order to realize that in it men's needs are more or less gratified, but in such a manner that human beings in both their private and social existence are administered from the cradle to the grave. If in such circumstances it is still possible to speak of happiness, then it is the happiness of the administered. A decisive tendency is observable in the philosophical formulation of the concept of progress, namely that of neutralizing progress itself. While in the 18th century until the French Revolution even the technical concept of progress was still understood qualitatively, and technical perfection as such was seen as one with that of humanity most dearly in Condorcet. This changed in the 19th century. If we compare Kant and Emil's conceptions of progress with that of Condorcet, we see immediately that a conscious neutralization is present. Kant and Emil attempt to provide a value-free definition of the concept of progress. Human perfection cannot be deduced from technical progress as such. This means, however, that the qualitative element of progress sees itself increasingly relegated to utopia. It comes to reside in pre-scientific and then in scientific socialist systems in which the humanitarian element triumphs over the technical element, and not in the concept of progress itself. The latter is neutral, value-free, or allegedly so. The allegedly value-free concept of progress, which has become since the 19th century increasingly characteristic of the development of Western, civilization and culture, contains in fact a quite specific valuation, and this provides the immanent principle of progress according to which modern industrial society has actually evolved. Its decisive elements can be characterized as follows. The highest value is productivity, not only in the sense of increased production of material and intellectual goods, but also in the sense of the universal domination of nature. The question arises, productivity for what? The answer that is always given is seemingly self-evident, for the satisfaction of wants. Productivity is supposed to serve the better and expanded satisfaction of wants and needs. It is the production of use values that are to man's advantage. But if the concept of want includes not only nutrition, clothing, and housing but bombs, entertainment machines, and destruction of surplus foods, then we can assert without risk that the concept is as dishonest as it is unsuitable for the determination of legitimate productivity. We have the right to leave open the question, productivity for what? It seems as though productivity becomes increasingly an end in itself, and the question the application of productivity not only remains open, but is increasingly repressed. Since productivity belongs inseparably to the modern principle of progress, it follows that life is experienced and lived as labor, that labor itself becomes the content of life. Labor is socially useful and necessary, but is not for that reason individually satisfying or individually necessary work. Social and individual needs are divorced, probably to the extent that industrial society develops according to this principle of progress. In other words, the labor that becomes the reality of life is alienated labor. This can be defined as labor that denies individuals the fulfillment of their human capacities and needs, and grants gratification, if at all, only secondarily or after work. This means, however, that according to the concept of progress that determines the development of industrial society, and its values, gratification, fulfillment, peace, and happiness are not goals, certainly not the highest values, but at most very low-level ones. To this value hierarchy, which second, in individual gratification and happiness only a subordinate clement, corresponds a hierarchy of human faculties that is characteristic of the concept of progress, the division of human nature into higher, intellectual, and lower, sensual, faculties. These are related to each other and that the higher faculty, reason, determines and defines the instincts against the claims of sensuality. Reason appears essentially as denial and the principle that enforces denial, whose task is not merely to direct sensuality, the lower human faculty, but to repress it. Accordingly, within this idea of progress, freedom is determined as freedom from instinctual compulsion and from sensuality, as transcendence beyond gratification and as the autonomy of this transcendence. Gratification must never be what constitutes the content and space of freedom. Freedom transcends gratification already attains towards something other, higher. And just like the productivity to which it belongs, this transcendence that is essential to freedom appears finally as an end in itself. One may no longer ask, transcendence for what and toward what? Transcendence as such suffices for the essential determination of freedom, and the questions, why this transcendence? Why this uninterrupted going beyond every already attained state? Why should precisely this dynamic define the essence of man? remain just as open as the question, why in fact should augmented productivity be the highest value and motive force? The freedom thus determined as end in itself and rigorously distinguished from gratification becomes free of happiness. It appears as a burden and yet is transfigured by philosophers and poets as the freedom of poverty, the freedom of labor, even as freedom in chains. They have lauded it as the crown of human existence and the distinctive quality of man. To this concept of freedom belongs a negativity without which freedom could generally not be defined. And in this negativity, idealist and modern existentialist philosophy, Kant and Sartre, are at one with each other. Sartre's definition of freedom as eternal transcendence for the sake of transcendence contains as the essential quality of freedom exactly the same negativity that is at the root of idealist philosophy. For the latter defines freedom as internalized moral compulsion, as the negation of gratification and happiness, in other words as the opponent of inclination. Particularly characteristic of the modern view of progress is the evaluation of time. Time is understood as a straight line or endlessly rising curve, as a becoming that devalues all mere existence. The present is experienced with regard to the more or less uncertain future. The latter menaces the present from the beginning and is conceived and experienced with anxiety. The past remains behind as what can be neither mastered nor repeated, but in such a way that it continues to determine the present just because it is unmastered. In this linearly experienced time, fulfilled time, the duration of gratification, the permanence of individual happiness, and time as peace can be represented only as superhuman or subhuman, as eternal bliss, which is possible and conceivable only after existence here on earth has ceased, or as the idea that the wish for the perpetuation of the happy moment is itself the inhuman or anti-human force that surrenders man to the devil. To summarize, progress itself, according to its explicit concept, is laden with disturbing activity, transcendence for its own sake, unhappiness, and negativity. It becomes an unavoidable question whether the negativity inherent in the principle of progress is perhaps the motive force of progress, the force that makes it possible. Or, to formulate it in another way that establishes the link to Freud, is progress necessarily based on unhappiness and must it necessarily remain connected to unhappiness and the lack of gratification? John Stuart Mill once said, "Nothing is more certain than that all improvement in human affairs is without exception the work of discontented characters." If this is true, then inversely it can also be said, and this would be in the strictest sense the other phase of this idea of progress, that contentment, gratification, and peace may afford happiness, but in a definite sense they are unsuited for progress. That war in the sense of the struggle for existence is the father of all progressive inventions, which then incidentally and often at a late date contribute to the improvement and gratification of human needs, and that both lack of fulfillment and suffering have been the permanent impulse to all of the previous work of civilization. Here we come to the core of the problem as posed by Freud. According to him, happiness is as little a product of civilization as is freedom. Happiness and freedom are incompatible with civilization. The evolution of civilization is based on the suppression, limitation, and repression of sensual, instinctual wishes and is unthinkable without a repressive modification of the instincts. This follows from what according to Freud is a very clear and unchangeable principle, namely that the human organism is originally ruled by the pleasure principle and wants nothing but to avoid pain and obtain pleasure, and that civilization cannot afford this principle. Because men are too weak and the human environment too poor and cruel, The denial and suppression of instincts became from the beginning fundamental conditions of all the unpleasurable work, the denials and renunciations that, as repressively transformed instinctual energy, make the progress of civilization at all possible. The pleasure principle must be replaced by the reality principle if human society is to progress from the animal to the human level. I have formulated this so emphatically only to counteract once more, in passing, the widespread misunderstanding that Freud is in any sense an irrationalist. There is perhaps no more rationalistic thinker of the past decades than Freud, whose entire endeavor is aimed at showing that the irrational forces that still operate in men must be subjected to reason if human conditions are to improve in any way, and whose statement, where it was, ego shall develop, is perhaps the most rational formulation I can imagine finding in psychology. Why does civilization require that the reality principle overcome the pleasure principle? What actually is the reality principle as the principle of progress? According to Freud's later instinct theory, which will be the basis of my argument here, the organism with its two basic instincts, eros and the death instinct, cannot be socialized as long as these instincts remain uncontrolled. As such, they are unsuited for the construction of a human society in which a relatively secure satisfaction of needs is to be possible. Eros, when uncontrolled, strives for nothing further than obtaining more intensive and perpetual pleasure, and the death instinct, if uncontrolled, is simple regression to the state that preceded birth and therefore tends toward the annihilation of all life. Thus, for culture and civilization to emerge, the pleasure principle has to be replaced by another principle, one which makes society possible and sustains it, the reality principle. This is, according to Freud, nothing other than the principle of productive renunciation developed as the system of all of the modifications, denials, diversions, and sublimations of instinct that society must impose on individuals in order to transform them from bearers of the pleasure principle into socially utilizable instruments of labor. In this sense, the reality principle is identical with the principle of progress, because it is through the repressive reality principle that instinctual energy first becomes released for unpleasurable labor, for labor that has learned to renounce, to deny instinctual wishes, and that can become and remain socially productive only in this way. What is the psychic result of the rule of the reality principle? The repressive transformation of eros, which begins with the incest taboo, leads, even in early childhood, to fundamentally overcoming the Oedipus complex and therewith to the internalization of the father's domination. At this time the decisive modification of eros under the reality principle occurs, its transformation into sexuality. Eros is originally more than sexuality in the sense that it is not a partial instinct but rather a force that governs the entire organism and that only later is put into the service of reproduction and localized as sexuality. This decisive modification of eros means a desexualization of the organism, and only this change can make the organism as bearer of the pleasure principle into an organism that is a possible instrument of labor. The body becomes free for the expenditure of energy that otherwise would only have been erotic energy. It becomes, so to speak, free of the integral eros that originally governed it and thereby free for unpleasurable labor as the content of life. To the extent that individuals themselves are affected by it, the repressive transformation of the fundamental psychic structure is the individual psychological basis of the work of civilization and of progress in culture. Its result is not only the conversion of the organism into an instrument of unpleasurable labor but also and above all the devaluation of happiness and pleasure as ends in themselves, the subordination of happiness and gratification to social productivity without which there is no progress in civilization. With this devaluation of happiness and instinctual gratification and their subordination to socially tolerable satisfaction, however, occurs the transformation and progression from the human animal to the human being, the progression from the necessity of mere instinctual gratification, which is not really enjoyment, to the reflective behavior and mediated enjoyment characteristic of and particular to man. What is the result of the repressive modification of the death instinct? Here, too, the first step is the incest taboo. The final deprival of the mother enforced by the father signifies the permanent mastery of the death instinct, the nirvana principle, and its subordination to the life instincts. For the incestuous desire for the mother also contains the ultimate goal of the death instinct, regression to the painless, needless, and in this sense pleasurable state before birth, which becomes instinctually more desirable the more unpleasurable and painful the experience of life itself becomes. The remaining energy of the death instinct is then made socially useful in two ways. As socially useful destructive energy it is directed outwards, that is, the goal of the death instinct is no longer the annihilation of one's own life through regression, but of other life, the annihilation of nature in the form of the domination of nature and the annihilation of socially sanctioned enemies inside and outside the nation. But almost more important than this external licensing of the death instinct is an internal one. It consists in the utilization of destructive energy as social morality, as conscience, which is localized in the superego and carries out the demands and claims of the reality principle against the ego. The result of the social transformation of the death instinct is thus destruction. In the forms of useful aggression and the domination of nature, destruction is one of the end-on sources of work in civilization. As moral aggression, unified in conscience as the claims of morality against the id, it is an equally indispensable factor of civilization. It is crucial that through the repressive modification of instincts, and through it alone, progress in civilization becomes not only possible but also automatic. Once the former has been successfully achieved, the latter is reproduced by the instinctually modified individuals themselves. But just as progress becomes automatic through the repressive modification of instincts, so it cancels itself and negates itself. For it prohibits the enjoyment of its own fruits and in turn, precisely through this prohibition, it augments productivity and thus promotes progress. More precisely, this peculiar and antagonistic dynamic of progress comes into being as follows. Progress is only possible through the transformation of instinctual energy into the socially useful energy of labor, that is, progress is only possible as sublimation. Sublimation, however, is only possible as expanded sublimation. For, once it is in effect, it is subject to its own dynamic, which extends the sphere and intensity of sublimation. Under the reality principle, the libido diverted from originally pleasurable but socially useless or even harmful instinctual goals becomes social productivity. As such, it improves the material and intellectual means for the gratification of human needs. But at the same time it denies man the full enjoyment of these goods because it is repressive instinctual energy and has already so preformed men that they do not know how to value life except in accordance with the hierarchy of values that rejects enjoyment, peace, and gratification as goals or subordinates them to productivity. With the growth of the quantum of energy stored up through renunciation comes a growth of productivity that does not lead to individual gratification. The individual denies himself the enjoyment of productivity and thereby provides the resources for new productivity, propelling the process to an ever higher level both of production and of the renunciation of what is produced. This psychic structure reflects the specific organization of progress in advanced industrial society. We can speak here of a vicious circle of progress. The rising productivity of social labor remains linked to rising repression, which itself in turn contributes to raising productivity. Or, put another way, progress must continually negate itself in order to remain progress. Inclination must continually be sacrificed to reason, happiness to transcendental freedom, in order that through the promise of happiness men can be maintained in alienated labor, remain productive, keep themselves from the full enjoyment of their productivity, and thereby perpetuate productivity itself. The self-renunciation in the principle of progress is not, I grant, formulated by Freud in this manner. But I am convinced that it is grounded in Freudian theory and appears perhaps most strikingly in the dialectic of patriarchal authority as explained by Freud. This process is of decisive import for the concept of progress. Freud's hypothesis about the origins of human history, regardless of its possible empirical content, compresses the dialectic of domination, its origins, transformation, and development in the progress of civilization into a unique image. Its main features are known. Human history begins with the primal horde in which the strongest, the primal father, rose to autocracy and stabilized his domination by monopolizing woman, the mother or mothers, for himself and excluding all other members of the horde from their enjoyment. And that means that neither nature nor poverty nor weakness compels the first suppression of instincts, which is the most important one for the evolution of culture, but rather the despotism of domination, the fact that a despot unequally distributes and exploits poverty, scarcity, and weakness, that he reserves enjoyment for himself and imposes labor on the other members of the horde. This first, still prehistoric step in instinctual repression compels the second, the rebellion of his sons against the father's despotism. According to Freud's hypothesis, the father is killed by the sons and devoured in a communal funeral feast. The first attempt to liberate the instincts and to generalize instinctual gratification, to eliminate the despotic, hierarchical, and privileged distribution of happiness and labor, is liberation from domination. It ends, according to Freud, when the rebellious sons or brothers see, or think they see, that they cannot do without domination and that the father was not really dispensable, no matter how despotically he ruled. The father is now voluntarily re-established by the sons and, as it were, generalized as morality. That is, the brothers freely impose upon themselves the same instinctual renunciations and denials that the father had previously imposed upon them. Culture and civilization begin with this internalization of paternal domination, which is the origin of morality and conscience. The human animalistic primal horde has become the first and the most primitive human society. The repression of instincts becomes the voluntary achievement of individuals and is internalized. At the same time, patriarchal domination is established as the many fathers who each for himself carry over the morality of patriarchal domination and therefore instinctual repression to their own clans or groups, where they are implanted in the young generation. This dynamic of domination, which begins with the institution of despotism, leads to revolution and ends after the first attempt at liberation with the re-establishment of the father in internalized and generalized form, i.e. rational form, repeats itself, according to Freud, during the entire history of culture and civilization, although in diluted form. It does so as the rebellion of all sons against all fathers in puberty, as the disavowal of this rebellion after overcoming puberty, and finally as the integration of the sons into the social framework in voluntary subjection to socially required instinctual renunciation, whereby the sons themselves become fathers. This psychological repetition of the dynamic of domination and civilization finds its world historical expression in the ever-recurring dynamic of revolutions in the past. These revolutions manifest an almost schematic development. Insurrection succeeds and certain forces attempt to drive the revolution to its extreme point from which the transition to new, not only quantitatively but qualitatively different conditions could perhaps proceed. At this point the revolution is usually vanquished and domination is internalized, re-established, and continued at a higher level. If Freud's hypothesis is really legitimate, then we raise the question whether alongside the socio-historical thermidor that can be demonstrated in all past revolutions there is not also a psychic thermidor. Are revolutions perhaps not only vanquished, reversed, and unmade from outside? Is there perhaps in individuals themselves already a dynamic at work that internally negates possible liberation and gratification and that supports external forces of denial? If the repression of instincts, even according to the Freudian hypothesis, is not only a natural necessity, if it has its roots at least just as much and perhaps primarily in the interest of domination and the maintenance of despotic authority, if the repressive reality principle is not only a result of historical reason without which no progress would have been possible, but above and beyond this the result of a particular historical form of domination, then we must in fact undertake a decisive correction of Freudian theory. For if the repressive modification of the instincts, which has until now constituted the main psychological content of the concept of progress, is neither naturally necessary nor historically immutable, then it has its quite definite limit. This becomes apparent after instinctual repression and progress have fulfilled their historical function and mastered the condition of human impotence and the scarcity of goods, and when a free society for all has become a real possibility. The repressive reality principle becomes superfluous in the same measure that civilization approaches a level at which the elimination of a mode of life that previously necessitated instinctual repression has become a realizable historical possibility. The achievements of repressive progress herald the abolition of the repressive principle of progress itself. It becomes possible to envisage a state in which there is no productivity resulting from unconditioning renunciation and no alienated labor, a state in which the growing mechanization of labor enables an ever larger part of the instinctual energy that had to be withdrawn for alienated labor to return to its original form, in other words, to be changed back into energy of the life instincts. It would no longer be the case that time spent in alienated labor occupied the major portion of life and the free time left to the individual for the gratification of his own needs was a mere remainder. Instead, alienated labor time would not only be reduced to a minimum but would disappear and life would consist of free time. Crucial here is the comprehension that such a development is not equivalent to an extension and increase of present conditions and relations. Instead, a qualitatively different reality principle would replace the repressive one, transmuting the entire human psychic as well as socio-historical structure. What really happens when this state, today still repudiated as utopia, becomes continually more real? What happens when more or less total automation determines the organization of society and reaches into all areas of life? In depicting the consequences I keep to the fundamental Freudian concepts. The first consequence would be that the force of the instinctual energy released by mechanized labor would no longer have to be expended on unpleasurable activity and could be changed back into erotic energy. A reactivation would be possible of all those erotic forces and modes of behavior that were blocked off and desexualized under the repressive reality principle. I should like to emphasize sharply, because the greatest misunderstanding is possible on this point, that sublimation would not cease but instead, as erotic energy, would surge up in new forces of cultural creation. The result would not be pansexualism, which rather belongs to the image of repressive society, for pansexualism is conceivable only as an explosion of repressive instinctual energy, not as the fulfillment of non-repressive instinctual energy. To the extent that erotic energy were really freed, it would cease to be mere sexuality and would become a force that determined the organism in all its modes of behavior, dimensions, and goals. In other words, the organism would be able to admit what it could not admit under the repressive reality principle. Striving for gratification in a happy world would be the principle according to which human existence would develop. The order of values of a non-repressive principle of progress can be determined on almost all levels in opposition to that of its repressive counterpart. Men's basic experience would be no longer that of life as a struggle for existence but rather that of the enjoyment of life. Alienated labor would be transformed into the free play of human faculties and forces. In consequence, all contentless transcendence would come to a close, and freedom would no longer be an eternally failing project. Productivity would define itself in relation to receptivity. Existence would be experienced not as continually expanding and unfulfilled becoming but as existence or being with what is and can be. Time would not seem linear, as a perpetual line or rising curve, but cyclical, as the return contained in Nietzsche's idea of the perpetuity of pleasure. You can see that the non-repressive principle of progress along with its own order of values is in a fundamental sense conservative. And none other than Freud himself stressed that in their innermost nature the instincts are conservative. What they really want is not unending and eternally unsatisfying change, not striving for what is endlessly higher and unattained, but rather a balance, a stabilization and reproduction of conditions within which all needs can be gratified and new wants only appear if their pleasurable gratification is also possible. If, however, this striving for gratification according to the conservative nature of the instincts can fulfill itself in actual existence under a non-repressive principle of progress, then one of the main objections against its possibility becomes invalid, namely the assertion that, once a pacified state were attained, men would no longer have any motivation to work and would degenerate to the dull, static enjoyment of whatever they could have without work. The exact opposite seems to be the case. Incentives to work are no longer necessary. For if work itself becomes the free play of human abilities, then no suffering is needed to compel men to work. Of themselves, and only because it fulfills their own needs, they will work at shaping a better world in which existence fulfills itself. The hypothesis of a civilization governed by a non-repressive principle of progress, in which work becomes play, has been suggested, interestingly enough, by just those thinkers in the tradition of Western thought who can in no other respect be considered as representatives and propagandists of sensuality, pansexualism, or the inadmissible liberation of radical tendencies. I shall mention only two examples. In his letters on the aesthetic education of man, Schiller developed the idea outlined here in Freudian terms of an aesthetic, sensuous civilization in which reason and sensuality are reconciled. The crucial thought is that of the transformation of labor into the free play of human faculties as the authentic goal of existence, the only mode of existence worthy of man. Schiller emphasizes that this idea can only be realized at a level of civilization on which the highest development of intellectual and mental capacities goes hand in hand with the presence of the material means and goods for the gratification of human needs. Another thinker, who can be suspected even less than can Schiller of being the spokesman of pansexualism or the unjustified liberation of instincts, and who is perhaps one of the least traditionally most repressive thinkers, namely Plato, has expressed this idea in its perhaps most radical form, and in the book that of all his books is by far the most repressive, in which the idea of a totalitarian state is presented in unequal detail. Precisely in this context he said the following: "The discussion is about the determination of what existence is actually the most worthy of man, and the Athenian speaks, why, I mean we should keep our seriousness for serious things, and not waste it on trifles, and that, while God is the real goal of all beneficent serious and less than L/for, man, as we said before, has been constructed as a toy for God. And this is, in fact, the finest thing about him. All of us, then, men and women alike, must fall in with our role and spend life in making our play as perfect as possible to the complete inversion of current theory. It is the current fancy that our serious work should be done for the sake of our play. Thus it is held that war is serious work which ought to be well discharged for the sake of peace. But the truth is that in war we do not find, and we never shall find, either any real play or any real education worth the name, and these are the things I count supremely serious for such creatures as ourselves. Hence it is peace in which each of us should spend most of his life and spend it best. What, then, is our right course? We should pass our lives in the playing of games, certain games, that is, lacrifus, song, and dance, with the result of ability to gain heaven's grace, and to repel and vanquish an enemy when we have to fight him. To the interlocutor has exactly the same reaction that we have. For he says, you have but a poor estimate 6 of our race. The Athenian answers, do not be amazed by that, Megillus. Bear with me. I had God before my mind's eye, and felt myself to be what I just said. You see that Plato is being perhaps more serious than ever, when at this point, in a consciously provocative formulation, he celebrates and defines work as play and play as the main content of life, as the mode of existence most worthy of man. In conclusion, I should like to defend myself against the reproach that I hope you have long been addressing to me, that we live in a reality that not only has nothing to do with the happiness presented here but is rather in all its aspects its exact opposite and promises to remain so, and that in this condition it is unjustified and irresponsible to portray a utopia in which it is asserted that modern industrial society could soon reach a state in which the principle of repression that has previously directed its development will prove itself obsolete. Certainly the contrast of this utopia with reality can scarcely be imagined as greater than it now is. But perhaps the very extent of this gap is a sign of its limit. The less renunciation and denial are biologically and socially necessary, the more must men be made the instruments of repressive policies that restrain them from realizing the social potentialities they would otherwise think of by themselves. It may be less irresponsible today to depict a utopia that has a real basis than to defame as utopia conditions and potentials that have long become realizable possibilities. Notes 1. Sigmund Freud, Neue Folge der Vorlesungen zur Einführung in die Psychoanalyse, New Introductory Lectures and